there are a lot of really weird stories in the Bible. If you read the whole Bible, there's stories that when you step back, you're like, this is so strange. Maybe you've been in the church for a while, and you're used to hearing the story about Noah getting drunk and passing out naked and then waking up really mad at his son. Maybe that's normal. Maybe you're even part of that story. It's normal hearing about like God killing everybody on the earth except some animals. And so maybe that's normal to you. Maybe like a snake speaking to someone in a garden trying to get them to eat what was probably a mango or something. Definitely not an apple, because that wouldn't have been worth it. But like, these stories, there are a lot of really weird stories in the Bible. You know, there's this story where Saul is like, hey, David, you can marry my daughter. And David's like, no, I got to earn it. Saul's like, okay, just go out and get like a couple hundred Philistine foreskins and bring those back, and you can buy my... What? And we read that. I don't preach on that a lot. This story is so weird. Such a strange story. What's interesting about this story is that not only is it a weird story, and not only does it show up in the Bible, but it shows up in the Bible multiple times. And I've said something like this before. Biblical authors don't waste space. They don't waste time. Sometimes we look at the Bible and we're like, oh, it's such a long book. This is like thousands of years. This is like from the beginning to like a long time later. This covers a lot. Where we're at in Matthew, we're like, oh, we've been going slow. We're just finishing chapter 8. We started when Jesus was a baby. Now he's probably in his 30s. That's if you were keeping a baby book on someone or something, like a helicopter mom that's just like every year, it's like, it would be a lot. They omit a lot. There's a lot that we don't have in the biblical text, and sometimes I feel frustrated by that. I'm like, I wish I knew about this and that. This story doesn't just show up in Matthew. It actually shows up in all three of the synoptic gospels. Now, if you're a little newer, in the New Testament, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, these 4 books that are called gospels. It's the story of the good news of Jesus Christ. It's the account of Jesus, the chosen one, the Messiah, who came to bring grace and goodness and to save lost sinners. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels. That means kind of a similar view. They write kind of similarly. John is kind of this weird hippie who's doing his own thing, and he's like, going against the norm, nonconformist. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke have this kind of similar vibe. And this shows up in all 3 of the gospels, all 3 of the synoptic gospels. The birth of Jesus doesn't show up in all 3 of the synoptic. And we love that story, right? Like, if you grew up in the church, we get kids every Christmas to come up and I totally loved it, Mom and Dad, thanks. But to put on these weird costumes and act out the Christmas story and stuff like that, I've never seen kids. We'd probably have a lawsuit on our hands if we got kids to act out this story. It's a weird story. But I think there's actually so much here. And I'll be honest, I put in way more time preparing for this morning than I usually do. And at the end, you can maybe see if I buried myself and did that actually worked against me, or if maybe that helped. Because there are some different details in the accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we'll get to some of that. And so there's so much that could be talked about. I want to lay a little bit of a roadmap for this morning. What I've actually done is work through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I got out a pen and a paper. It's this old thing we used to write on if you're young, but pen and a paper, and I just tried to fill in all the details. And what I want to primarily do this morning is I've pieced it together from the 3 Gospels and to try to read the full story. And I want to invite us to just make a few observations along the way. This story, I think, has more theological implications and observations than most texts of this length in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, it's a big statement, but I think that's true. There's so many questions we could arrive at. And so, unfortunately, I did think, maybe we should spend half the time talking about demon possession and stuff like that, and we're just going to spend hardly a little time there. I think the thing that makes me maybe a pastor, or maybe partially ready to do this role, is that when I was 17, I started following Jesus, and I just decided to start studying Scripture. As a 17-year-old, I opened the book, and I just started taking notes. And I just kept doing that for a long time. And I've read this story probably hundreds of times. It wasn't until a few years ago there's this little detail in it that really popped out to me that changed the whole thing. So what I want to do this morning is I want to invite us into this story together, piece it together, make some observations as we go, not giving enough time to all the things that are in there. And at the end, I want to invite us into this little detail that I missed probably hundreds of times reading this. And maybe at the end of that, you'll disagree with my hermeneutical approach, and you'll be like, that's too small of a detail, right? But I want to invite you into that, and hopefully it hits you in the same way it hits me. And then I actually want to take a little bit of liberty and draw that into something that maybe go a little bit kind of on a global scale at that, but then something quite specific for us here in Town and Field Church, and hopefully that'll land well with you. At the end of that, we're going to have one more little bit of table time, 5 minutes. We're actually going to spend some time praying together. And it might be about something in the message. It might be whatever. I'm not going to give you a ton of, we're adults here, right? So, well, there are a couple kids here, but you guys are emerging adults, and we can figure out how to pray together. So anyways, we're going to piece this together, read through Matthew, we're going to jump around a little bit, and hopefully we can observe some cool things as we go, and I'm going to try to keep us on schedule here. Matthew 8:28. When he, Jesus, arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, I'm just going to pause there for a second. The other side, just so you know, when you read that in the Gospels, usually that's showing a cultural shift. That's usually Jesus going from a Jewish region to a Gentile region, which means non-Jewish, or Gentile region to a Jewish region. So Jewish to non-Jewish or back. That other side doesn't usually just mean, oh, it's different beach. It usually is actually like language to say he's somewhere else. Might not sound that significant to us. Jesus' earlier followers, the easiest way to say it is that most of them were racist. They were Jewish people who thought they were better than other people. Not only did they think they were better than other people, they would avoid Gentiles. They would stay away from them. They looked down on them. And Jesus strangely goes to Gentile regions and is like, actually, maybe that's not how it goes. So he goes to the other side. He's in a Gentile region now. He was just in a Jewish region. Now he's in a Gentile region. Gadarenes in Mark and Luke, it's called the Gerasenes, and in some translations, yours might say Gergesenes. It's all the same thing. It's just this non-Jewish region. So there's 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. Now, some of you around your table might have come across this question. It's like, why does it say 2? I thought I've read this story somewhere before, and I thought there was only 1. And that's a really good question, because in Mark and Luke, it says 1. Now, the top of your Bible, like above this section, probably has some kind of working title, like Jesus Restores Demon-Possessed Men, or in Mark and Luke, Jesus. I like to call this the story of the Shrieking Streakers, okay? I like to have my own names for stories. This is the story of the Shrieking Streakers. In Matthew, that title doesn't quite make sense, but we'll get there. Anyways, I wanted to spend a bunch of time here, and we're not going to either, but there are some great blogs I could send you as well by why is there this disagreement between 2 and 1, and I think there's actually some good scholarly work if that casts doubt into your heart, if you're skeptical. I know I've been there. Happy to share some of that with you. Anyways, these 2 demon-possessed men, which we're not going to get into what all of that means. I would assume in a biblical context that means people who are filled with evil spirits. What does that mean today? I think we'll have space to get there in the Gospel of Matthew, sorry, but we'll get there at some point. So that's just a way to make you have to stay at Town and Field Church in case you're thinking about leaving. So 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. So what do we have in Matthew? We've got these 2 dudes, they're demon-possessed, they're living in a graveyard, and they come to meet Jesus. And in Mark, you can find out that these men not only are naked and living in the tomb, or not only, sorry, that we haven't gone there yet, that we'll get there. These men are not only demon-possessed and living in the tombs, but it says that they cut themselves regularly with stones, so they're self-harming regularly, and that they cry out night and day. They're these people who are just wailing and making noises and just cutting themselves in public. And in Luke, this is where we find out that he says in his gospel that they have not lived in a house or worn clothes for a long time. These Shrieking Streakers. These are naked dudes who are living in a graveyard. In Jewish culture, a place of death is an unclean place. Being around corpses, unclean. Jewish people to a lot of or Gentiles to the Jewish people are unclean people. They're self-harming. They're covered in blood. That's an unclean thing. They're crying out. They're naked. These are gross dudes. This is like the worst case scenario you could end up in. Wait, there's more. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. They were so violent, you couldn't get by. I imagine Jesus' disciples at this point, like, Jesus, what were you thinking? Did you know about this? Like, we got here, now we can't even, we're blocked. And, it's not like Jesus, like, I forgot to check Apple Maps for a traffic jam or something. Like, Jesus knew, right? Well, I think most of us can probably agree that Jesus wasn't as surprised as his followers might have been. Not only, in Gospel of Matthew, it says not only could people not pass that way, not only were they so violent, but we find out in Mark and Luke that they would chain them in irons and chains, and these guys would break these chains. Again, not to spend a lot of time on what demon possession means, but most scholars would argue that there's some kind of supernatural strength, not in a really great Superman kind of way, but more villain type way, because these demons, these evil spirits living within them have given them some kind of supernatural strength. They were violent, they were breaking these chains, and Mark, it says that there's no one strong enough to subdue them, so we send Catlin out there, and we're like, oh, he's got it. He comes back in, beat up, bruised, and we're like, wow, these guys are tough, right? No one's strong enough to subdue them, and they actually, in Luke, it says that they tried to keep them under guard. But no one could do it. You couldn't get by. You couldn't mess with these guys. You couldn't deal with them. They were these crazy, naked, bleeding because they're cutting themselves, screaming out, homeless guys living in a place of death. They're Gentiles, and they're so violent that they hurt people, that they break chains, all these things. This is a wild situation. I imagine Jesus, like last week, Talsi killed it, teaching us from Jesus calming the storm. The disciples at that point are like, Jesus, why'd you bring us out on you knew the weather, right? It's like, why'd you bring us out during a storm? Now they're like, forget that. Why did you bring us here? Like, we're trapped. We can't even get past these guys. They come up to him. They say, what do you want with us, Son of God? Actually, they didn't say that. They shouted it. And in Mark and Luke, we find out they were shouting this at the top of their voice. What do you want with us, Son of God? They know. They're like proclaiming that he is the holy divine one who created the universe more so than most of his followers have at this point in the gospel. And they say, have you come here to torture us before the appointed time? That's an interesting phrase, before the appointed time. They're like, I checked my Google Calendar, Jesus. It's actually Thursday that you're supposed to come and torture us. They know. The book of Revelation hasn't been written yet. They know there's this time when Jesus is going to come and he's going to judge the world, good and evil, and he's going to bring resurrection. He's going to create a new world, and that they would be judged. And they know how that's going to go for them. In Mark and Luke, they actually uses the language where they begged Jesus, don't torture us. They're like at Jesus' feet. Mark and Luke shows this. They've fallen at his feet, and they're begging him. This is actually a picture, and I don't want to make too much of it. It's actually a picture of what worship is about, is falling at the feet of Jesus. And the demons actually seem to take that posture a little bit more quickly than a lot of the people who are observing Jesus. I want to actually, there's a little bit of a gap here, so I want to hop over to Mark 5, 8 through 10. It's going to be on the screen, or if you've got Bibles, feel free to follow along. In Mark it says, for Jesus had said to him, come out of this man, you impure spirit. That's interesting. Jesus has already, at this point, said, come out of him, but the spirit's still there. Again, this is one of those questions that we're not going to spend a lot of time on. Why didn't the spirit come out the first time? Then Jesus asked him, what is your name? My name is Legion, he replied, for we are many. And he begged Jesus again and again not to send him out of the area. It says not to send him out of the area there. In Luke, it says that they begged him not to send them into the abyss. Again, they know who Jesus is, more so than most of the people who are following Jesus and listening to Jesus. They know that one day that's where Jesus will send them. Verse 30 in Matthew 8 again. Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. I would assume the demons just like bacon, so that's why they asked for the pigs. I don't know. Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. I've actually never thought about that, so maybe I'll look it up and you can hit me up and remind me sometime. I don't know if I'll come up with a good answer. So there's this big herd of pigs. This is interesting because, again, this signifies that they're in a Gentile culture, not a Jewish culture, right? Jewish people, really sad before Jesus came, not allowed to eat bacon, right? Jesus came and died on the cross, two really big things. Forgave sin, put bacon back on the menu. This is like transformative. We are joining God in restoring all things when we eat bacon, okay? So there are all these pigs. This is a food source for Gentiles. There wouldn't be a herd of pigs over in Jewish region. In fact, in Mark 5, it says not only was there a large number of pigs, but there were about 2,000 pigs. This is a lot of pigs. I mean, that'd be a lot of pigs now, but we've got ginormous farms. And this is like country farmers a couple thousand years ago, 2,000 pigs. The demons begged Jesus, if you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs. He said to them, go. In Mark and Luke, he gave them permission. Again, these demons we don't know if these men came and fell at the feet of Jesus because they're like, we need you, or if the men fell at the feet of Jesus because the demons are controlling them and we can't stand in the presence of the living God. This is who this Jesus is. And they beg him. They have to ask for permission. They're not just like, okay, we're out of here, we'll run away. They ask for permission. He says, go. So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off, went into the town, and reported all this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus. I just want to make a note. I think if this happened, it would make sense for them to go report it to the town. But think about what just happened to these farmers there. They've already hated putting up with these naked, these shrieking streakers, right? These crazy demon-possessed dudes who are so frustrating. They're bleeding, and they're screaming, and they're naked, and it's like they're hiding their kids' eyes every time they go outside because they're like, oh, these weirdos. They already hate having these guys around. Now they don't have to deal with them, but now like their whole livelihood just ran into the sea. Like Jesus turned the pigs into lemmings and they're gone. They've killed themselves. It would be so frustrating. How offensive is that? What a weird thing in our culture where our gospel is so tied up in we need to be nice before we follow in the way of Jesus. And we realize Jesus was a kind and loving king, but he wasn't always that culturally nice or appropriate. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus. I'm going to pick up, because there's a little bit of a gap here, and pick up some details in Luke 8:35 to 36. There it is. And the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone out sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured. What an interesting picture. What happens at the start when Jesus comes? These men, they fall at Jesus' feet out of fear and anguish and worry. Jesus restores them and heals them, and they end up once again at his feet in a place of peace, and other people are instilled with fear because they realize the power and the magnitude of the living God walking amongst them. The Bible talks about fearing God, and in a modern context, we usually like to say like, oh, that just means respect, or like God's like this perfect, holy God. Like, he comes up and he messes things up and he disrupts our lives. I think it's an appropriate response when God is really at work to be stricken with a little bit of fear. When we realize the guilt of our own conscience. And I would imagine some of these skeptics here who are mad at Jesus feel this conflict of being discontent with who he is and what he's calling them to, and angry at him, but recognizing, oh man, like who are we to be angry at him? And when they saw him, this is back in Matthew 8, when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave the region. Again, in Luke, it says they were overcome with fear. This theme comes up again. They're scared. So interesting. Before, there are these naked, crazy dudes who fall at the feet of Jesus, screaming out and begging. And at the end, Jesus flips it, and they're calmly sitting. They're wearing clothes for the first time in a long time. They're subdued. No one has been able to subdue them. Before, they were breaking the chains, and now Jesus has broken the chains off of them. We just sang this song earlier, and it says, death has no grip on me. Jesus came and took people who were living in death, living in a place of death, and he brings them life, and he restores them. And I want to actually hop into Matthew 9:1. Sorry to Matt, because I'm kind of he's not here, but I'm encroaching on his territory for next week. In Matthew 9:1, it says, Jesus stepped into a boat, crossed over, and came to his own town. And once again, I'm going to hop over to Mark 5, because there's a little bit more that we can just wrap up this story. And hopefully we've pieced it all together. If I've missed anything, please let me know. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man, Mark says man, but the two men or whatever, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. It's really interesting. This guy's this radical life transformation, like everything. He's free of these evil spirits. He now knows how to wear clothes. He's probably stopped self-harming. He's not screaming all the time. He's not like violent as much anymore. He wants to go follow Jesus. That sounds great. Jesus gives him this interesting response. He's like, actually, you've got a mission field right here. Your life now that you've met me needs to be about joining me in restoring all things and bringing transformation in the region that I've put you in. And that's the call God puts on all of our lives. And most of us say, yeah, but there's a new season of Stranger Things. Yeah, but this. Yeah, but people at work, but I don't know, I could get in trouble with my boss if all these things. What does this man say? Nothing. He just went away and began to tell in the Decapolis, that's a region he lived in, how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. I don't know, I don't want to make too much of this verse. I don't get the sense that he was going around and like preaching deep theology. He probably wasn't that theologically rich. He was just going around and sharing his story. And people's lives were changed as a result of that. Now, there's so much that could be talked about in this passage. It's amazing. Jesus' power over the spiritual forces of the world. What is demon possession? So many layers in this, and how healing comes, and why the people are mad. Why did Jesus say yes and leave when they asked him to leave? He came over there. But there's a small detail, again, that I want to invite us to notice. Like I said, maybe you've already picked up on this, but this took me years and years before I noticed this, and I think this is so significant and such a game changer. I've built this up a lot now. I hope this isn't a letdown for some of you. And what we're going to do is we're just going to look at what happens right at the start of the narrative and what happens right at the end of the narrative. So we're going to look at Matthew 8:28. It says, when he arrived at the other side, in the region of the Gadarenes, I don't know how much I put up, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. And then 9:1 says, Jesus stepped into a boat, crossed over, and came to his own town. Here's what's so fascinating. This is the only thing that happened here. And I don't think, theologically speaking, Jesus was particularly surprised by the order of events. Jesus sailed across the lake, the Sea of Galilee, in a crazy storm, just to do this, and then immediately left to go. And maybe that doesn't sound like, well, maybe nowadays with gas prices, that does sound like a big deal to us, but like, the disciples are like, I just imagine they land there and they're frustrated because they're like, oh man, like this is what we're doing, dealing with these guys, this is terrible. And then all the town hates them and they're scared of them and they're freaked out and everyone's freaking out and losing their minds. And then Jesus is like, yeah, that's it, let's get out of here, let's go for another boat ride. When they just went through the storm where they thought they're gonna lose their lives, like the night before. This is crazy. I love what Talsi shared last night. You know, that quote from Chuck Smith, when Jesus says you're going over, there's no way you can go under. Jesus said we're going to the other side. It's a little bit of instruction. It's a little picture. That's what the Bible is. It's a little bit of a picture of what it means to live in God's will. God doesn't give you all the details. If Jesus had told his disciples, we're going over, by the way, you're going to think you're going to die. There's going to be this crazy storm. Our lives are going to be in danger. And when we get there, these naked dudes might start touching you, but don't worry, they're covered in blood and they're Gentiles and they're living in a graveyard. Courtyard, that was weird. They're living in a graveyard. Jesus' disciples would be like, forget that. Jesus says, come and obey me. And along the way, there are going to be crazy things and crazy challenges, and all I want is for you to be obedient and faithful. All Jesus did, Jesus sacrificed a lot. Jesus had a lot on his plate when he was, creating the world and sustaining it. And he comes to earth. And in this narrative, like a whole day, a whole night of travel back to somewhere else, to a really uncomfortable context. It was just for these 2 dudes. These are the last people I'd want to hang out with. I don't know about you. Actually, if you are like, no, I'd really love to hang out with like self-harming, screaming, naked, demon-possessed guys, then we'll pray for you. You might be one of them. This is crazy. Not just demon-possessed. When they say legion, that's a reference to the Roman army unit that could mean up to like 6,000 men. We don't know what that means. There's this crazy thing going on. What I love is in Isaiah 53, you can read this beautiful description of Jesus, and he's referred to as a suffering servant. Jesus didn't come to be served. He came to serve. And it's this strange thing about this not normal kingdom, is that we are called to serve Jesus, but not in the typical way that a king demands servitude so that he can increase in stature, but he demands that we serve him because as we serve him, we learn what it means to truly serve. Jesus is the ultimate servant leader. How many of us have risked our life in a crazy overnight journey to go to some randos that we don't know in a messed up situation that seems hopeless and seems disgusting and everybody hates, and then after that, losing a whole bunch of credibility with friends and family and people around you. After that, you're like, all right, I'll make another crazy overnight journey to go do something else and to serve more people. Jesus is the ultimate servant leader. He didn't come to be served. He came to serve others. I think it's quite easy, though, for us to embrace the parts of Jesus that we like. He says, come and follow me. Like, hey, I'll follow you. Like, I'll do these things. But to actually wake up with that mentality. What did Jesus leave on the other side of the lake? Crowds, popularity, fame. His name was growing. His brand was getting big. Team Jesus was getting quite popular. He's like, yeah, but there are these 2 guys. They just need some help. They need it. Jesus didn't say, we're all too busy. None of us, I would suggest none of us were as busy as Jesus when he was watching over the entirety of the universe, listening to our prayers. But for some reason, he was like, yeah, I'm going to go down, and there are these 2 guys living in a cemetery somewhere. What would it look like for us, for me, when I wake up in the morning, not to say, well, what do I want? What do I hope to go today? What's going to enable my emotions to be stable? But to actually say, I live in a broken and hurting world. What does it actually look like to say, I'm not here to be served, but I'm here to serve? Even I find this tension with my kids. I love them, and I'd love to say that love is really unconditional. Let's be real. I want them to treat me well. I find validation in that. And Jesus says, forget it. Jesus says something so eternally rich and rewarding for us. I talked about this a few weeks ago when Jesus was telling the scribe he's a homeless dude and he can come follow him if he wants, and the scribe doesn't. It's really hard to follow Jesus, but there's nothing richer and more rewarding than following Jesus. And I want to challenge us what it would look like to be a town. And like I said, I want to get to something kind of specific, and maybe you'll like it and maybe you won't. But I want to challenge us, first of all, to just ask ourselves, what would it look like to live our lives in this radical way that says, even no matter what the cost is, I'd hop in that boat. Jesus had a lot of people following him. Only a small group got in that boat. Jesus says the harvest is plenty. There's a lot of work to be done for the kingdom, but the workers are few. Only a few people hop in that boat. And I think many of us in churches nowadays are those people in Matthew 7 that Jesus talks about that say, Lord, Lord, I did all these things. And Jesus, I think, is essentially saying, well, you didn't get in the boat. You didn't come with me to these really vulnerable, gross dudes. They were hated by everyone, but I loved them. I loved them to the point of being willing to join them in being hated by others in order to bring restoration and healing to them. I want to talk about something pretty specific at Town and Field that's always on my heart. Since I came, it's been an interesting journey, year and a half or something. Actually, yesterday was 2 years since I flew out here to meet people. And it's been an interesting journey through COVID and all that. And essentially in September, we relaunched Kidstown, something I'm so passionate about. And I actually think this relates to this a lot. And there are a lot of things I could talk about right now. And I have 6 seconds, so I'm going to do this one quickly and go a little over time. But when I think about Jesus going to the most vulnerable, I can't help but think in the church of our deep need and call to get over ourselves as adults and stop thinking about what we want, what we need, what we deserve, and to give it up and say, I'll go to the most vulnerable. I would argue that in general, the most vulnerable people in our church are the people that the statistics are stacked. My kids are growing up in a pastor's household, and I know how that worked for me. You know, the statistics are stacked against our kids to actually be following Jesus as adults. And here are a few things we know. We know that the statistical chance of any of our kids, and you're not special, you're not different, you're not unique. Even me as a pastor working in a church, in fact, it might even be worse. None of us are special. The statistics are that our kids probably will not follow Jesus as adults. That's reality. We know that. The second thing we know is that in order to change that, in order to curb that, it doesn't mean just continuing to do the same thing where we're like, okay, well, let's make really great services for adults and then try to have a program for kids in the basement, which arguably, let's be real, for a lot of us as parents is just so that we don't have to deal with them during the service. We know that the best chance our kids have is not to have a program, but is to have committed small group leaders, and that's why our goal in September was to kick off a Kidstown program on Sunday mornings where we had committed small group leaders who show up they get here at 8:30, they pray, they hang with their kids either in first service or second service, and they attend the other service. They spend a lot of time here, and no, we don't pay them because Jesus will one day, right? Yeah, okay. So we know the stats are stacked against our kids. We know they're like these guys that don't have much of a chance. We know what their best chance is to be known by leaders who show up every single week and say, I care about you, and I love you, and I know you by name, and I am going to model what it means to follow Jesus. It doesn't mean, their best chance isn't having a program that they can go to that's some large intake. The best chance they have is to have that relational development from someone who says, follow me as I follow Jesus, as Paul says in one of his letters. We know that. And the other thing we know is that making choices to actually give of ourselves and join Jesus in his servant leader. At this point, I know I've already lost half the room because people are like, I'm not going to work with Ryan kids. With Ryan kids? No, I'm not. Well, you might be thinking that too, but I'm not going to work with kids, Ryan. Same thing. Kids, Ryan, same thing. I'm not going to work with kids. Just follow me for a second. Because here is where it goes out of the basement and it comes up here. Because it is important for us to grow spiritually. I will tell you that in my years working at a church, following Jesus, studying scripture, I don't know it all, but I think I've hopefully learned a couple things, is that one of the best decisions, I would say maybe second to spending time reading scripture, one of the best decisions you can make for your own life spiritually, and on so many levels as you try to follow Jesus, one of the best decisions you could make for your relationship with Jesus is to join him in being a servant leader and serve his mission of the local church. Jesus came and gave everything he had, including his life. He died naked on a cross. So interesting. He goes and he clothes the naked, yet he dies naked on a cross. They hurt themselves, and then they hurt Jesus on a cross. What an interesting parallel. And Jesus gives all of it for the mission of the local church because he cares about it. It's his bride and it's his body. And one of the best decisions we can make for our lives spiritually is to do that. I'm so passionate about this. This might sound like, oh, this is Volunteer Appeal Sunday because they're like we are trying to build up for something exciting in the fall, but this isn't me being like, okay, we need, put your hand up if you'll be like a grade 5. Like, this is not that. I am not trying to appeal. I am not trying to sell anything. What I am trying to do is help you guys and the people downstairs, some of our most vulnerable people, slow down a little bit, vulnerable people, to have our best chance at having a thriving relationship with Jesus Christ. And we can't if we won't get into the boat. If you're content having a shallow relationship with Jesus, stay on the shore. If you don't have a deep relationship with Jesus, follow him into the deeps, through the storm, deal with the streaking streakers, wherever he takes you, and recognize it is not about myself. Jesus says it's not about me, and he invites us to say that. I got to wrap up here. Listen, it will change your life. Years ago, one of the best things that ever happened was Darren invited me to become a weekly small group leader for youth. I spent time with grade 7 boys all the way through 6 years of my life. Every week they'd come to my house, they'd eat my food. We'd talk about Jesus, they'd break stuff. They'd pretend they didn't break stuff. Yeah, she's right, they microwaved Xbox controllers. Not kidding, it's crazy. I look back on my life. Nothing's formed me more as a Jesus follower. This is an invitation for us to get into the boat with Jesus and know what it looks like. I could talk about this for a long time. I'm obviously passionate about the next generation, but equally I'm passionate about every generation. You might say I'm too old, I'm too busy, I'm too this, All of Jesus' disciples were too something. Jesus was too something. We're all too something. The question is, and maybe it's not specifically Kidstown for you, the question is, are we willing to look past some of our excuses and some of our reasons to say no and to look at Jesus and say, yeah, I'll hop in that boat with you. Sounds awesome. You might have a reason, like, oh, I got kids. We'd love to just chat with you. We've actually thought through some of that, if you can believe that, and thought through some solutions to empower people to be able to serve even in the midst of busy schedules or having kids or those types of things. Maybe it's not Kidstown, it's somewhere else. Again, I don't have some quota I'm trying to fill today. It's not about that, and if you're hearing it like that, I'm so sorry. I'm not trying to communicate it that way. I care about us as a community being people who look at a narrative like this that shows up in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and just not John because he's a weirdo and talks about other stuff, but it shows up so much in Scripture. I can't help but imagine that this Jesus who sails across a lake and back across a lake through a storm with a bunch of freaking out toddler disciples just to deal with this invites us to be servant leaders like him. Anyways, we're going to throw a timer up on the screen right away. Invite you to take 5 minutes to pray around your table. Maybe it's about something in the text. Maybe it's about the message. Maybe there's just other stuff on your heart and mind, not directed. At the end of that, I'm going to come up and talk for like 2 or 3 more minutes about an exciting announcement coming up. So go ahead, we'll throw the timer up there, and I hope you guys have a great time praying together.